Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, and I'll serve as your host. It's thrilling as we get together for the last time this semester to be in a room that is standing room only and to have so many friends and colleagues as well joining us via Zoom today in this hybrid seminar format. We're also especially thrilled to have with us Kyle Meng for his talk today about the developments in U.S. climate policy. It's a bit of understatement in that title. Um, Kyle Meng is an associate professor at the Brin School of Environmental Management and the Department of Economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Professor Meng recently served as senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Energy Market Solutions Lab. He received his PhD in sustainable development from Columbia University and a bachelor's in civil and environmental engineering at Princeton. And as a first-generation immigrant, Professor Meng was a recipient of the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans. One of those things I got to learn about someone who I've known for the better part of 20 years. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's been a while, but it's been a great time. And it's great to have you with us here. So Kyle, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Good. The mic's good. Okay, great. Thanks everyone. Thanks for the invitation. When Joe asked me a few months ago to join you all, I thought, oh, this would be so nice. I would be like 2 weeks out of the administration. I can share. I was the senior climate economist at the CEA. I thought I would share my personal views on what to do next in climate policy. My last day at the White House was October 31st. 5 days before the election. Of course, when I started to put together these slides last week, I thought, oh, this title might need to be updated. Thought about this one. But then I thought that was like a little too dire. We got to be forward-looking and being a little bit more optimistic. So I'm going to talk about a topic that, in my view, is very salient today. It's going to not go away, I don't think, certainly not in the next decade, and may even show up in some form in the next 4 years, okay? And that is really this kind of interaction between how we think about climate policy and how we think about trade policy, okay? And I'm gonna kind of set this up in terms of the many kind of cross currents right now that we're seeing both here in the US and elsewhere kind of at this intersection. I'm a climate economist or an environmental economist, so I put climate first. But it might very well be that this talk and the future we're talking about is just like trade policy. Okay, so just a little bit of caveats. Okay, so a few observations. Where are we right now? Obviously, like we're all in this kind of like recalibration and speculation mood. We don't really know. But let me highlight a few kind of observations that I have about some trends that I don't think are going to change certainly in the next 4 years, but really these are kind of like important trends in the next decade or so. The first is this kind of like emerging new, I'm going to call it the new Washington consensus. You can call it whatever you like, but that this notion that we're going to be thinking more and more increasingly about using tools of trade and trade restrictions as a way to meet a number of kind of goals, from kind of goals involving U.S. kind of competitiveness, as well as kind of our national security goals. You can think of U.S. competitiveness and national security as sometimes clumped together as like our kind of industrial policy and strategy goals, as well as kind of more broadly our geopolitical objectives. I put like the strategic part in parentheses because I think that's where there's going to be a lot of distinction between different views. Okay, I do think that for better or for worse, there's this view that trade tools are now on the table more so than they've ever been before, and it's just a question of how judiciously do we apply them, if judiciously at all. Okay, so that's one observation. And the second one related, which is that if you thought climate change was like a gnarly, multidimensional problem before, well, really, it's become even more complicated because it is now almost fundamentally intertwined with concerns about national security, geopolitics, and industrial strategy. And some of this has always been there, obviously, but I think a lot of this now is this recognition of the kind of great powers competition of the 21st century, which is going to be largely between the U.S. and China. And for better or for worse, on a lot of major kind of important clean energy technologies, like EVs, like solar panels, like batteries, the U.S. is admittedly more than a few years behind in terms of industrial competitiveness and the technological frontier compared to the PRC. So, so when we think about climate concern, we're now increasingly thinking about not just, abatement at the lowest global cost, right? But abatement where we might have to be willing to swallow a little bit either higher costs or even a delayed amount of kind of, decarbonization to account for the fact that increasingly many countries want to develop parallel, robust supply chains of clean energy technologies such that the global kind of clean energy system isn't just reliant on one country and one country with potentially concern on geopolitical ramifications. Okay, so that's another thing that I think it's important to think about. The third is that now thinking just about here in the U.S., the U.S. has achieved a bunch of pretty remarkable things in the last couple of decades in terms of decarbonization. I would say, decarbonization has been fastest in the power sector, well on its way. We're starting to see some signs of that in transportation, but obviously, and household residential kind of sectors. So that's really just in the early stages. But in terms of the set of policy tools, or really the lack thereof policy of tools, and where we stand, industrial decarbonization of our manufacturing and kind of like traded goods, that really hasn't happened really yet, and certainly there isn't kind of policies in place. Okay, and so certainly a lot of folks when thinking about the next round of climate policies have really focused on industrial policies, and here you have to think about trade. It's inevitable you think about trade because the concerns about carbon leakage associated with unilateral policy really come into play because these are primarily, or a lot of it, traded goods. Okay. Another observation is that it's pretty clear that this is a global problem. We need global solutions, but the Paris Agreement, the kind of paradigm that we are in today, has its limitations. Okay. We're currently still negotiating the next round of NDCs under the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement fundamentally is a bottom-up system without, explicit enforcement mechanism. Okay, and so there's an interest in thinking about trade, not only for those reasons, the reasons I've listed above, but because built into our trading system is a monitoring and verification enforcement system that, I would argue doesn't really have a parallel in other kind of mechanisms in which we think about, global climate cooperation. And then the last thing, now this is not very specific, but I think this is going to be a major forcing event in the next few years, is that there is a carbon tariff that the world is going to be experiencing in a little over a year's time. So many of you know the Europeans have had an emissions trading system, a carbon price, essentially for the better part of a couple of decades now. And they're moving towards a system where they're going to try to, quote unquote, level the playing field for their domestic producers who are subject to the carbon price with a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So carbon tariffs apply to carbon intensive trade exposed goods coming into the EU border from their trading partners. Importantly, the key part of this is that is an adjustment mechanism, meaning the carbon tariff is introduced because it needs to kind of complement the domestic carbon price to cover for competitiveness and leakage concerns. But this is something that is going to be happening. We're in a provisional phase right now where for the last year or so, the EU has actually required imported goods to report their emissions to the EU kind of registry without actually paying a tariff. But that payment of tariffs will be required on January 1st, 2026. Okay. All right. So all of this, some of it disparate, some of it linked, suggests that even despite political developments, very recent political developments, that there's going to be just growing momentum for us to be thinking about the linkage between climate policy, reducing emissions, and trade policies here in the U.S. and elsewhere. If you don't believe me, you can just point to a recent working paper that Catherine Wolfram and co-authors have written showing the kind of increasing adoption or consideration rather of carbon and trade measures, climate and trade measures, both from kind of ones that are already implemented to ones that are being considered. So not only is the EU going to be doing this in January 1st, 2026, the UK is currently considering such a policy, the Australians are considering such a policy, and the Canadians as well. All of those considerations are actually in tandem with a domestic policy, okay? But so this is really a trend that I think we're not going to see reversed in anywhere near in the coming years. Okay, so climate and trade is not new. It's been around for a very long time. I was involved in the kind of early days when we were talking about like with the Waxman-Markey bill in the mid-2000s. And even then, as well as the early kind of like climate trading systems or policies from the Senate in the 2000s, there was always this notion that you would pair up a domestic measure, a domestic carbon price, with some kind of carbon tariff to level the playing field. Okay, so this idea has been around for a long time, but the traditional way we think about it is, again, there's two parts. There is the domestic policy part where you introduce either regulation or explicitly some kind of carbon price, increases, lowers emissions by increasing costs for domestic, producers. Now, there's concerns there from doing that. You will, lead to kind of leakage from kind of relocation of economic activity outside your border and maybe loss competitiveness, and that you would kind of offset that by quote unquote leveling the playing field by having a combination of carbon import tariffs as well as carbon export subsidies. Okay, so this is what the EU ETS does. Like I said before, with the CBAM, this is the kind of underlying structure behind the Clean Competition Act, which is a bill that has been proposed by Senator Whitehouse, and it's also more or less the kind of basic idea behind Bill Nordhaus's Climate Club idea. This is a long tradition, and it certainly has an even longer tradition in the economics literature. More recently, what you've been seeing is debate on carbon tariffs without the domestic component, okay? Increasingly, there's been talk about, well, this is supposed to address climate and competitiveness concerns, okay? What if we had the same arguments, but try to do it with just carbon tariffs, okay? And especially just carbon tariffs without an explicit domestic component. So you're not adjusting for anything. You're just introducing tariffs on imports on carbon-intensive borders at the border, okay? And again, with the same arguments of saying, well, this should be able to kind of both reduce global emissions and also addressing climate change and also addressing potential U.S. competitiveness concerns. And this is really kind of the underlying structure. There are other details, but mostly the underlying structure behind the Senate's foreign pollution fee that's been introduced by Senator Cassidy from Louisiana. Okay, so, okay, great. There are some open questions, okay? I think we understand this world reasonably, or at least there's a lot of work in this world and some of it done by people here in the room. This world, I think we understand a little bit less, okay? Even though a lot of the kind of political dialogue has been saying, well, it serves the same purpose, okay? And in particular, when you just have a carbon tariff, I think it's worth asking, well, what does this actually do to global emissions, okay, GHG emissions, and as well as U.S. and kind of emissions of what is that distribution between U.S. and our trading partners? What does this do to U.S. competitiveness, which I would just basically use as a shorthand for like U.S. output of like iron and steel, for example, okay? And then as well as what would this do for to U.S. consumer prices? There's a lot of interest in thinking now about tariffs as a source of revenue, okay, for U.S. government coffers. So there's an interesting question of like, well, what is the resulting revenue that you could raise from having a carbon tariff? And then also this idea, again, is what if we now were to build a climate club out of just a carbon tariff? So instead of this notion of like a carbon tariff and domestic policy where, you join the club by adopting a domestic policy, but now you don't have tariffs with each other, right? But you have tariffs to everyone that's outside a club. What if you had a climate club where the kind of eligibility for entry is just adopting carbon tariffs, without actually adopting any domestic regulation. How do we think through that? Okay, so what I'm going to try to walk you through is essentially an analysis trying to think through some early work, answers to these questions. Okay, because again, we're in a world where increasingly there's a lot of debate about like just thinking about carbon tariffs under the same justification of climate benefits and competitiveness benefits, but really we want to do an exercise of thinking through like what are those really? Okay, so I'm going to walk you through very quickly to like 3 pages of math, okay? But for those of you who are like, I don't want to see any math, here's like a quick preview of the results, okay? What does this do to US global emissions, US and global emissions? The answer is not much, okay? And if anything, what it does is it increases having just so think about like a carbon tariff on iron and steel imports to the US, okay? What does this do? It protects US industries. And so in fact, what it does is it actually allows US iron and steel emissions to go up, but forces the emissions of our trading partners, primarily like India and Brazil, to go down. The net effects of that is like negative, right? So it will be global abatement, but it is very unequal in the sense that it's really forcing all the abatement from our trading partners while US emissions go up. Obviously, this is going to have some implications when we think about like the global negotiations where issues of fairness really are important, okay? What about US competitiveness, again, in terms of output? US emissions go up with a carbon tariff, and so US output goes up. We produce more iron and steel, okay? So that's good. But what's interesting is that US output also goes up from a combined tariff and domestic carbon tax policy. So think about what happens. So with a carbon tariff, you basically allow US producers a larger share of the US domestic market, okay? So there's room to grow. In fact, that room is so big such that the US domestic market can even absorb a US carbon tax such that the net effect of those two is actually increase US output while the US economy or US sector decarbonizes. Okay, so I'll show you that it's actually not that big of a difference between changing US output from just a carbon tariff versus a carbon tariff and a domestic carbon price. Okay. Second, what happens to US government revenue from just a carbon tariff? Very little. Okay, and this is the same kind of argument for you've seen when it's been proposed having this kind of broad-based tariff across all imports. There's this argument like, well, this will raise a lot of revenue for the US government. It turns out it's not that much because we are actually not trading enough, okay, to be generating a lot of revenue from carbon import tariffs, okay? And obviously that will go down as our imports go down as well, right? So there's also that kind of adjustment. And then what happens with climate clubs? Something very interesting happens with climate clubs. So imagine a climate club where if you join a climate club based on a carbon tariff, a country joins the US and that country now trades without any tariffs, but jointly they put up carbon tariffs to all other trading partners. Initially, that actually lowers global emissions because you're putting more pressure on countries not in your club to reduce emissions, okay? But at some point, that relationship flips, okay? At some point, as more countries join your club, okay, you are putting now more pressure on fewer number of countries that are not in your club, okay? And so in the limit, think about it in terms of in the limit where everyone joins your climate club, we don't ask us or anyone else in the club to do anything, and we don't have any carbon tariffs on each other, but that's where we are today. So the idea with the carbon club is that in the limit, with just a carbon tariff, you actually just get back to where we are today, okay? And that's a very different world than a world where a climate club is based on eligibility for the club is based on actually doing something domestically, right? That's the carrot and stick system, right? You do something, you adopt some kind of regulation or at a shadow price or actual price on emissions, you lower emissions, and you gain, your benefit is gaining entry into the club trading system, right? A carbon tariff only system based on a club based on just a carbon tariff, it's basically like, it's kind of like, it's just like giving away the cake without requiring you to work for it. And so in the limit, you're saying like, well, everyone joins, but we're not asking anyone to do anything to join. And in the limit, when everyone joins, we're back to where we are today. Okay, so the logic of a climate club really falls apart when you're not requiring any kind of domestic action. So I'm just going to walk you through like a model with some calibrations showing you this. But that's basically the general intuition of where those results are coming from. Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. So what I'm going to show you is nothing new. Like I've been in the White House for a year. I'm like now like far away from like the academic frontier. So what happens here is just like we're going to build on a whole bunch of work on climate and trade that has been out there already. The intellectual origins about thinking about climate and trade goes way back, at least in the economics literature, for a few decades. What we're doing with a quantitative trade model is also nothing kind of new. That's long established work using different data sets like the GTAP data set. That's been done by a lot of people, a very large literature. The most recent paper in this literature that's like really at the frontier thinking about optimal climate policy is Faroukhi, Alesh, Karapur. We're going to take some of that structure. We're going to use a data set, an input-output data set that's at a finer spatial resolution than GTAB, which is like has about like 60 sectors. What we're going to use is a product called XEO-Base that has about 200 sectors. So you can now really like think about very targeted carbon tariffs, not just on like chemicals in general, but actually like fertilizer. Okay, so that's what we're able to do. And then we're going to build on some kind of literature thinking about like building in endogenous GHG abatement into this model. Okay, and then obviously when we start doing some climate club kind of simulations, we're going to be building off of a very long literature on thinking about multilateral climate negotiations that predates Bill's work, but also follows up with more recent work by Bart Halstead and others. Okay, all right. So very quickly, I'm just going to walk you through 3 pages of math just to give you a flavor of what's going on. But for those of you who are like familiar with quantitative trade models, this should be kind of like very old hat for you. Okay, so we're gonna, okay. So first of all, why are we doing this? All these questions are general equilibrium questions. Okay, so when you're introducing a carbon tariff, you have to not just think about like, oh, what is like, lower imports and higher prices due to U.S. industries, but you have to think about now like our trading partners, what they're going to do in terms of their change of output and how trade flows are going to change for their exports and their imports. Okay, obviously a very gnarly set of questions, but we have in economics at least we have a standard set of tools to think about this, which is building on essentially quantitative trade models that have become quite popular in recent decades. So we're going to take a standard model, think about countries around the world indexed by I, sector S. Households are going to have preferences that are kind of constant elasticity of demand. And you can think it's like Armington assumption that's going to be governed by this Armington elasticity within a sector. And then across sectors, we're going to have a multi-sector model. They're going to aggregate using Cobb-Douglas with an expenditure share. Labor supply inelastically for every country in one location. Here, the production is kind of interesting in the sense that we're going to introduce essentially a production structure, Cobb-Douglas, which essentially you can think of it as like a firm is choosing between dirty and clean goods. Here we're just going to call it like essentially fossil fuels and labor. And we're going to have essentially an exogenous energy sector, or rather an energy sector that's going to supply to the economy with an assumption that there's going to have an exogenous price. But the important thing about kind of this formulation is that we have a model where we can actually allow for a certain degree of endogenous GHG abatement. Okay, so in the sense that when you introduce either a domestic carbon fee or an imported carbon fee, you can have reallocation both between clean and dirty inputs. Okay, and also within and across firms within a given country and sector. Okay, so in other words, we can think about the policies we're going to introduce as both changing kind of the composition of goods in the economy, but also within a particular kind of product category, there's going to be abatement in terms of optimal or kind of reallocation of clean and dirty inputs. Okay, and then trade is going to be kind of following the standard iceberg assumptions. Okay. Math, equilibrium, we solve for this. Okay, all right. So, but let me talk to you about what are the kind of policy experiments we're going to run. Okay, we're going to think about 3 policy components. The first is just a domestic policy. So your standard like a carbon tax is introduced in an economy. It doesn't have to be a carbon tax. It could be some kind of regulation that kind of leads to a shadow price in regulation. But this is essentially raising the cost of dirty inputs in your economy. Okay. We're going to then also consider a carbon import tariff. And they're going to be what's called a relative carbon import tariff. What does this mean? So this is the way carbon import tariffs are constructed in both Senate bills, both the Clean Competition Act and the Foreign Pollution Fee. It says that if you are dirtier than the US, right, if your emissions intensity is higher than the US, you are going to be kind of facing a carbon import tariff that is proportional to the gap between your country and the US. Okay, if you're dirtier in the US, your goods are going to be facing tariffs at the border when those goods arrive in the US. If you're cleaner than the US, there are no tariffs. Okay, and then you can imagine a similar kind of flipped kind of export subsidy based on the same idea. Okay, so this is what's written into Clean Competition Act, is saying that if you're cleaner than the US, you're fine, you're no carbon tariffs, but if you're dirtier, you're going to be facing a tariff that's proportional to how dirty you are relative to the US. Okay, and then from all this, we can solve through the structure of the model a bunch of new equilibrium, because we can imagine playing around with different compositions of a domestic fee for any country, right, and these trade measures. Okay, and we can solve for new trade flows, output, prices, welfare, as well as changes in emissions, government revenue, and then, of course, ultimately welfare. Yeah.
When you say the
at that sector, for that sector. So like take an iron and steel. If your iron and steel emissions per unit output is dirtier than the US, you get a tariff. Okay. Now, so very importantly, like I said, this is nothing new. There's a long literature in this. There's an old literature that says, what if we introduce just a carbon tariff? A carbon tax, and that's the whole leakage literature. Okay, it's like if you just have a unilateral measure without any kind of border measures, you're going to have emissions leakage. Okay. The more recent climate and trade literature is thinking about these jointly. Okay. All we're doing is taking the same structure of those models and say, what if we just did this instead? Okay. So again, it's more of a quantitative exercise to think through what actually happens if we just had a carbon tariff without these other components. Okay. But the structure and the kind of modeling exercise that we're doing should not be anything new, because this is like a very well established literature. Okay. All right. Here's the data. I won't go into great detail here, but essentially the model is going to be calibrated by this XGO-based data set, which is this environmentally extended input-output matrix for global production. The kind of benefit of this is that rather than having a limited or broad set of sectors, you have very fine sectors, 200 sectors. Okay, so we can actually think about, like, if you were to introduce a carbon tariff on iron and steel, or on aluminum, or on fertilizer, what that would look like. Of course, you can say, like, do I actually believe the numbers at that resolution? Fine, that's a fair critique, but we're going to run with it for now. And then where we can, XGO-based is going to give us emissions intensities in terms of emissions per value output. A lot of the policies are actually written in terms of emissions per quantity. Okay, and so where we can, we're going to take a bunch of sector-specific studies to actually get emissions per quantity, to actually use that to construct our carbon tariffs. Okay, all right. Okay, so let me just show you some of the data, because I think the data was going to tell you a few kind of big main kind of storylines that the modeling is going to interpret, but I think you can see a lot of it from the data itself. Okay, so let me just focus on one sector, iron and steel. Okay, this is the ranking of emissions intensity, GHG intensity. Okay, so this is like scope 1 and scope 2 of emissions intensity per ton of steel. Okay, across countries. Okay, so the first thing you can see is that this is kind of well documented in other places, is that the US is the cleanest of all the kind of major steel producers. Okay, the graph on the right is plotting on the y-axis US emissions intensity. Okay, and then on the x-axis is the share of global output. Okay, you take all the iron and steel produced around the world, what is that country's share? Okay, and you can see that, like, that there is this kind of roughly positive correlation and that like in particular, China is like relatively dirty and produces a lot of the world's iron and steel. Okay, and in fact, a lot of the kind of popular kind of narrative in the world has been, oh wait, isn't this a problem? And shouldn't we be trying to deal with this? That is like, shouldn't we be trying to do something about trying to clean up the major dirty producers? Okay, from a global perspective. Okay. Now, of course, what this picture misses is the fact that China is a huge economy and largely just consumes its own steel. Okay. And so what that means is that, as you will see in a few slides, is that yes, China is a major producer, but there might be limits to how trade measures could affect that behavior, because this is largely to service the domestic market in China. Okay. All right. So here's a way to look at this. So this is like, thinking about globally across countries. But because this is bilateral trade data, you can now also just think about like, well, what does it mean in terms of US exposure? Okay. So on the x-axis, again, for iron and steel, I'm showing you, again, emissions intensity. But here, sorry, that's y-axis. On the x-axis, I'm showing you now the US share of, like, in terms of imports of that country's production of iron and steel. Okay, so like, what is this doing here? This is basically U.S. own consumption, okay, of U.S. output. So we consume about 80% of our own steel, okay? But you can see that basically outside of that, we consume about 60% of Mexico's steel. The U.S. consumes about 50% of Canada's steel, okay? But across the board, you see roughly a negative relationship, meaning most of the steel that is coming in to the U.S. from elsewhere are actually the cleaner steel already to begin with. Okay, the dirtier steel, like the steel from like India and Japan and maybe China, we're not really consuming much of it. Okay, and that might be because of existing trade measures and restrictions or other reasons. Okay, but in fact, if you want to think about a world where like U.S. carbon tariffs are very effective, this relationship should be positive, roughly, but it is not. Okay, what we're bringing into our shores is largely, well, we're largely consuming our own stuff, and we're bringing in cleaner stuff from elsewhere. You can think of this in another way, which is instead of seeing it from the standpoint of the exporting country's perspective, you can just think of it in terms of the share of U.S. consumption. Okay, what share of our consumption of iron and steel is coming in from these countries? And again, it's like largely countries that are relatively clean. Okay, and the dirtier countries, for whatever reason, we are not really importing that much of our own domestic consumption. Okay, so if you want to think about like to a first order, if you introduce a carbon tariff, what this would do is essentially it's like, and this is the U.S. by the way, so we're the cleanest, so we're the bottom. So what this really does is that like it kind of imputes or it kind of impacts mostly countries to the upper right. Okay, countries that are dirty and for which we rely on a lot for our consumption, but notice there are like not that many countries up here. Okay, and so if you want to think about it, again, in contrast to this picture, we were saying, okay, globally, there are some really dirty producers that are producing a lot of steel. When it comes to our exposure through our trade patterns, we are actually not exposed that much to dirty steel. Okay, you can see a similar pattern when it comes to aluminum. I'm going to just fly through this in the interest of time, but here in the US, we're not actually the cleanest. There's this notion that like the US is cleanest in all these kind of like, heavy industrial sectors. Turns out it's really just iron and steel. And when it comes to aluminum, we're kind of middle of the pack. Okay. When it comes to paper, we're a little bit above the pack, above the median. Okay. So we're not actually that much cleaner. Okay. But in all of these situations, like, yes, you have dirty producers that are larger kind of global producers, but our exposure is not tilted towards the dirty producers. We're mostly importing from the cleaner producers. Okay. All right. So that should give you a flavor. Yeah, Charles.
I know you're converting everything into quantity on the denominator, but does that story look different if you use value in the denominator?
So the question is, does this story look different if we like instead of per quantity, we do it per value? In some sectors, it's a very close correlation between GHG per quantity and GHGs per value. In others, they're not. I don't know them off the top of my head right now, but yeah, it's true in some, but not all. No. Okay. All right. So let me tell you just about. So we're going to just show you two policy runs. The first one is like just the carbon tariff. okay? So just introducing a carbon tariff, kind of like the Cassidy bill, we're going to benchmark it, or we're going to just like peg it to like a $55 per ton carbon price. But everything result that I show you is just basically, this doesn't matter. Everything is just scales up and down depending on what the carbon price is. And then policy B is going to be kind of how we traditionally think about climate policy or climate and trade policy, which is combining a carbon tariff and export subsidy and a domestic carbon price. Okay. All right. So here's what happens when you introduce just a carbon tariff from the US perspective, okay? And this is what happens with change in imports, or US imports. When you think of like, goods arriving to the US from countries, okay? So what happens is that if you just have a carbon import tariff, you're gonna lower imports from a bunch of countries, such as, the biggest impacts are gonna be from Australia, India, non-EU Europe, which is basically Ukraine, okay, and Russia, okay. But notice that like you're not really hitting, like, for example, China, because we're just not that exposed to steel from China. What happens in terms of output? Okay, so there's a new equilibrium. Countries are now going to be producing different quantities of output. These countries that are hit are going to also suffer losses in output. So Brazil, India, non-EU Europe, and the US is going to increase output of iron and steel by about 1.5%. Okay. Compare that now to the combined policy, the kind of traditional way we think about climate and trade policy, which is combining both kind of domestic and foreign components. What you see pretty dramatically is that what happens is that essentially you're gonna see a similar pattern in terms of kind of impacts, but these patterns are going to be lessened because we're basically going to be allowing slightly more production, or sorry, slightly less production in the US, offsetting the losses elsewhere. Okay, and the thing that's like really interesting, that was like really surprising to me, is that there's this narrative that like if you adopt a carbon price, that you would essentially lower US output, that this is like going to be bad for US competitiveness. But in fact, what happens is that the combination of the two actually still results in higher US output of iron and steel of about 1%. Now, not as high as if you just had a carbon tariff, which is like 1.5%, but you still actually increase US output. And again, the intuition is that the two work in tandem. The carbon tariff provides protection, which opens up the domestic market, and that gives enough room such that US producers can both decarbonize and expand output at the same time. Okay. What about GHGs? This is really dramatic. So this is now the change in GHG emissions in terms of per ton, okay, for our trading partners and then with the US. So a carbon tariff largely shifts emissions around the world. Okay, it's like an output tax, and so emissions from Brazil, India, and like non-EU Europe go down, but emissions in the US go up. The net effect of this is like a small negative number, but if you worried about like kind of fairness concerns in the international negotiation space, this should be like alarming to you. That basically what this policy does is essentially push emissions reductions elsewhere, okay, while allowing US emissions to go up. If you had a combined policy with a domestic policy tax, what the tax does is it cleans up US industry, okay? And so yes, we still see reductions from our trading partners, but we also now have much more reductions from the US, okay? And that's like a big difference in terms of global climate. The net effect of this is actually quite large, okay? All right, so what I'm gonna show you is, let me just summarize this in the interest of time. So let me just give you some numbers. So I focus on, for example, iron and steel here, okay? So with iron and steel from a GHG perspective, US emissions go up by about 2 tons, okay? And other countries go down by 5, and the net effect is about 3 million tons. So this is like not that big, like kind of small potatoes. But if you were to do this with a combined policy, US emissions go down dramatically, okay, by about 17 million tons. And yes, our trading partners' emissions go down, but most of the global reduction is basically loaded from the US, okay? And so if you, from a climate perspective, if you're like run these policies across these different sectors, you see something like a 4 to 5 times more global abatement by having the combined policy. But the competitiveness impact difference is not that big. So if you look at, again, iron and steel, output of US iron and steel from just a carbon tariff goes up by 1.6%. But you have the combined policy, it still goes up by 1%. Again, this combination of the tariff gives you enough protection such that you can both clean up and increase output. Okay, and across a lot of sectors, in fact, output for aluminum, for glass, for nitrogen fertilizer, they all go up, even with a domestic carbon price when it's paired with a carbon tariff. Okay, all right. This is the last thing I'll talk about, which is how do you think about climate clubs? Okay, so I'm gonna. Again, the idea of a climate club is that if you join a club in the kind of traditional formulation, if you join the club, you join a club only if you adopt a carbon fee, a domestic policy, and then you put up like a carbon tariff on all your trading partners outside of the US. Kind of the new idea is to say you can join a carbon club without doing anything domestically. You can just join a club and you have to put up carbon tariffs, but you don't have to actually do anything domestically. So what I'm going to show you is just one table where I'm going to show you 3 different structures. I'm going to think about the EU plus the US, US plus OECD countries, and then that plus India and Brazil. Okay, this is just kind of a thought exercise. There's no kind of notion of like incentive compatibility here, but I'm just going to show you just like what are the greenhouse gas consequences of these different club structures. So the thing that's really quite remarkable, as I mentioned earlier, is that if you just have a carbon tariff, what happens is that in terms of global emissions, as the club expands, global abatement does indeed initially go down, or in terms of like you're going to get more cuts with greater membership. But what happens is that if you break this down to US emissions, other club emissions, and non-club emissions, you can kind of see what the story is that as you expand the club, US emissions doesn't change, it still goes up. But now other club emissions go up, like in this case, the EU. And so now you're loading all of your emissions reductions globally onto the non-club members. Okay, you're putting more pressure on them. But at some point, you run out of countries to put that pressure on. Okay, and so like in this case where you have the US, EU, India, and Brazil, what happens is that you're now putting kind of so much pressure on the remaining few number of countries that are not in your club while emissions go up within your club such that the net effect is now falling. All right, so this is kind of an inverted U shape, okay, such that as the club expands, you kind of max out in terms of global abatement to a certain level, and then as you kind of bring in more and more countries, that abatement drops. And again, in the limit where every country in the world is in the club, you're back to where we are today, so no abatement. Contrast that with our classic kind of climate club notion of adopting a carbon tariff and domestic policy. Here, as the club expands, global abatement increases. And this is pretty sizable. So like when you have a club of this structure with the US, OECD, India, and Brazil, you're getting abatement from the US, you're getting abatement from other club members, and you're getting abatement from non-club members. And this is like kind of roughly equivalent to like the annual emissions of like Mexico. Okay, and this is just for like, for these essentially 7 sectors, okay, at a $55 per ton valuation. So this is meaningful, whereas a club structure with just a carbon tariff basically amounts to, very little abatement as the club grows. Okay. Oh, that's equivalent. Oh yeah, that's equivalent to how much we think IRA, if they were to hold, would lead. So this is meaningful. This is very meaningful. Yeah, this is very meaningful. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me just summarize. So again, methodologically nothing new here, but I think there are some interesting points about this exercise, which is if we were to go and talk about carbon tariffs, a US carbon tariff regime that under the arguments of like climate ambition and competitiveness, I think we need to be a little bit cautious. The first is that it looks like it doesn't lead to that much global abatement. And in fact, there's some real kind of equity considerations in terms of where that abatement is coming from. In terms of global abatement, it's about 1/5 the amount of abatement that you will get from a traditional combined domestic policy and trade policy setup. And with a climate club, with a carbon tariff only idea, you're again loading all your emissions abatement on our trading partners, okay? There is competitiveness benefits to U.S. Producers, industrial producers from a carbon tariff only approach, but it's actually not that much more than having the combined policy. And in fact, the combined policy could, in many sectors, actually lead to increased output, okay? Again, because of the logic that the tariff provides sufficient protection such that domestic producers have now access to greater share of the U.S. market, which allows them to actually adopt decarbonization while still allowing output to go up. Climate Club becomes complicated because you now have not very much significant GHG abatement, and the logic of like more global abatement as your club expands fails with just a carbon tariff only approach. And then I would just point out that if you had a global regime that's based on just a US domestic policy, there's going to be tension between that and what the EU, UK, Canada, and Australia are trying to lead in terms of a more traditional climate club idea, which is based on carbon tariffs and domestic policy. And here, I'm just going to, again, go back to Catherine's recent working paper showing you media hits in red for after in other countries after major announcements of the EU CBAM policy, showing that essentially that kind of media hits and discussion about carbon pricing is responding to key developments in the EU CBAM. Again, we're still waiting to see kind of how much this perceived pressure actually translates to actual policy adoption, but there is a response in terms of how countries who are EU trading partners are thinking about responding in order to have access to the EU market, and this is an incentive we don't want to completely dissipate. Okay, last slide. Very quickly, two points. A carbon tariff, for all these reasons, have complications, but there are other complications as well. First is measurement. So this is much harder to operationalize than a standard tariff because you don't just need to know US emissions intensities, for which we now still do not have an official measure for, but you need to know emissions intensities of all your trading partners. And we generally just don't have eyes on emissions intensities of other countries. There's going to need to be some kind of negotiations, and that is actually a kind of an important kind of complication, both in terms of any US measure and also what the EU is going through right now. The second one is that there's actually some very interesting interactions for other traded goods, okay? So I've given the example of Brazil. It's not obvious if you think about incentive compatibility that even with a system of like both a carbon tariff and domestic measure, that Brazil necessarily wants to join the US. Why? Brazil currently buys, the US currently buys about 20% of Brazil's final steel. Okay, so that's like their exposure and maybe their incentive to join, to adopt a carbon tariff. But they also, of their intermediate steel that they use to make final steel, 55% of that comes from China. Okay, so would Brazilians be willing to join an EU club if doing so raises the cost of inputs for them to service the rest of their 80% of where they're selling their US steel, their final steel? Okay, so it's not obvious. And this is where I think there's going to be some broader trade thinking because where are the other leverage points that the US has? It's not going to be in kind of carbon intensive traded goods, but it might be, for example, in the fact that like for our energy transition, we need a lot of critical minerals for which Brazil has a lot of. And so you can imagine greater kind of market access granted through these other traded goods for which you can provide an extra carrot. That is like Brazil joins the US club, adopts carbon tariffs, and the US further boosts demand for Brazilian critical minerals for which the US needs a lot of and Brazil wants to sell. So again, a lot of these kind of other dimensions that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about climate trade. All right, I'm gone way over time, so I'm going to stop there. There are a lot of kind of moving pieces here, so I'm happy to answer some questions. Thanks.
So I have the benefit of hosting Kyle in class this afternoon, where I'll be able to pepper him with a lot of questions. So I want to open it up for questions from the audience now. We'll run until about 1:15.
Yeah.
Hi, Kyle. I'm a student here at the ID program, and I have a question. So you mentioned in the last slides that the two major restraint right now is one measurement, the other one is like the trade incentive. So in terms of measurement, what kind of perspective do you see in the future can help solve that problem?
The measurement is actually, it's like a huge issue. So there are two paths here, both of them, well, there are three paths here, all of them very tricky, okay? So the first path is to do what the EU is doing, which is to say, we are going to come up with our own measure of US emissions intensity. And they have a process ongoing right now, okay? And if a US importer comes in, you either rely on the numbers that we give you, or you have to prove that you can verify your own numbers, okay? But the problem is, in order for that verification to work, the EU needs to have verifiers that are allowed in the US borders. And we have a system like that. It's like the FDA does that. So we have FDA inspectors that go around the world that inspect like, food safety in our foreign producers. But you're gonna have to imagine a global system of like verifiers, or like here's the EU verifier allowed into like Cleveland Cliffs Mill to verify your emissions. Like gets dicey very quickly, okay? So that's one way. The second way is the EU comes up with their own number and the US comes up with their number, and there's a negotiations that says we're gonna mutually recognize each other's numbers, okay? Not too different from like, the statistical agencies across countries like getting together and saying like, here's the GDP numbers that we recognize in each other and so forth from like national accounts. But that needs to be a whole process. And there's a question of like, can anyone join? Do we trust everyone's numbers? Like who gets, and so that's another way of mutual recognition. The third, it's like satellites. This gets much more contentious. But there are satellites up there that different countries have launched. And we don't traditionally have eyes on emissions from others, but we could. And so you imagine a system where the EU has like Copernicus satellites, and the Japanese have satellites, the Chinese have satellites, we have satellites, and we all just like watch each other's emissions and use that as like a way to, I don't know, to verify other people's emissions. So those are like three paths. They're all kind of geopolitically fraught. But they have to be resolved, because this is why these measures are much harder than traditional trade measures. Because traditional trade measures just require data that the home country collects. This requires data from our partners.
So this is focused, in that recent response focuses on measures based on carbon content. But as you know, the EU isn't based on carbon content. It's based on whether you have a carbon price at home. And that's a different approach. I can understand there's different politics about that. And you started out, your intro slides were about a little sort of political, but could you just talk about maybe the economics of this alternative approach, not based on carbon content, but based on whether people have a domestic carbon price?
Yeah, so the EU system does need emissions intensity. So if you don't have a carbon price, if the US doesn't have a carbon price, the tariff we are facing, or US exporter faces, is the EU carbon price times the US emissions intensity times output. So so they still need measurements of emissions intensity outside their border. But to your broader point, Jim, like the EU system, for all its kind of warts and flaws, at least fundamentally maintains, the argument, the carrot and stick argument, which is the carrot being EU market access, and the stick being you have to clean up to get access, and that's like a pretty sound logic. The carbon, just doing a carbon tariff, basically, like I said, it's like like giving my kids like cake with them promising to eat their broccoli later on. So it breaks that incentive structure. And so I worry, and many people worry, that if the US just went out with a carbon tariff only approach, that essentially would just like third countries would just choose to join us and not join the EU system. And again, with the carbon club, logic, that's not great, because you join a club that essentially doesn't require club members to do anything, and that doesn't really end up helping the climate.
For being here. I have a question about the U.S. oil and gas policy in Trump administration 2.0. Things that we all see that in his election he showed much preference on oil and gas, and he also promised that he will dismantle the most of the agendas from Biden administration. So I'm wondering that I want to know that how will this work on the U.S. GHG since he showed since he promised that the oil and gas company will get a huge development in the future decades. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like I warned it, it's dangerous to speculate at this point. I mean, I think we're all going to speculate, but you know, the new administration, I think, is going to be so mercurial that it's hard to know. You know, I would just say that, like, you know, it's likely that, for example, you know, the pause on LNG exports, which kind of was already lifted by the court a few months ago, will probably be permanently lifted. Beyond that, it's hard to say, but I would also say that, like, the LNG pause, its global GHG implications are actually not clear. I don't know if Costanza is here. She has a great job market paper showing this, that basically the reason why it's not clear is that it also do with, like, so, you know, what the pause does on you know, pause on LNG exports, if it binds, it's not clear that it's actually binding because we're already having in the system like double the export capacity for the next 10 years. But if it binds, it essentially means more natural gas here in the US, right? Lower natural gas prices and higher natural gas prices globally. And then that changes the patterns of substitution between natural gas, coal, and renewables, both here in the US and elsewhere. And the net effect of that ex ante is not obvious. And Costanzo's work shows that it will actually, like, the pause will actually raise global emissions because it would basically allow for, like, you know, substitution towards coal in different parts of the world. So that's one area where I think, like, new administration will try to do, but the climate consequences of it is not, you know, obvious and might even be beneficial. Yeah.
Catherine Wolfram, MIT Sloan. Great, super clear presentation. Just following up on Jim's point about you have EU credits for domestic carbon prices. I think that's a really kind of underappreciated aspect of the CBAM. And the idea is that it really kind of helps the virtuous cycle. So for instance, Turkey right now, 50% of their manufacturing is exported to the EU. They're doing the calculus, like, our sector's already paying the carbon price. We could keep the revenue domestically. And, you know, if you have more and more countries thinking like that, and then they put up their own CBAMs, it could lead to this kind of tipping spillover where you get carbon prices. And I also, to the measurement question, then if every country has a carbon price, then you're putting the onus to do measurement on those countries themselves.
Yes.
And they have the incentive to do the measurement, right? Because they're collecting the tax revenues domestically.
That's a really good point. Yeah, so all true. And the other thing I would add is that, you know, there's a lot of concern, I think, that it's going to continue with the next administration about, well, will the US be really affected by the EU CBAM? And I think if you just look at the data, I think it's like the answer is no, because first of all, we don't export that much of our carbon intensive goods to the EU. Okay, so our exposure is like a very small share of our production. The other thing is that the EU CBAM, independent of that, has an ambiguous effect on US exports to the EU. The reason why is that the EU CBAM has a scale and composition effect, right? It lowers all imports into the EU, but then it also rotates imports in favor of cleaner trading partners over dirtier trading partners. The US, in some cases, like in iron and steel, is the cleanest. It's among the cleanest, okay? And so it could be that actually US iron and steel exports actually increase relative to without the CBAM because of the second compositional effect. So in general, I mean, there's the economics and there's the politics. So, and those things are clearly divorced from each other. But from the economic side, it's like the impact on the U.S. economy is likely to be very small, or kind of for these traded goods is likely to be very small, and if anything, might even be beneficial. And so I think that's an important point to make.
Thinking about the next 4 years, and do you have any intuition or kind of back the envelopes of like, what about just a blanket tariff, system that is agnostic of carbon intensity? Like, what would that do to GHG emissions? I mean,
I would say it would do less, because I have a suspicion which countries will be hit by that. And you can see from the graphs that those are not the ones we're necessarily trade exposed to. Yeah.
We're on net importing carbon right now, though.
Yeah.
Right. So there may be something.
Yeah. Yeah.
The key question is, would we apply those tariffs to, say, Canada and Mexico, despite a current trade agreement, since they're two big trade partners, especially in some of these sectors you showed?
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, maybe two more if we're quick, and then we'll wrap up.
So Mike, thank you very much for the presentation. So my question is actually very broad, but I would like to learn if you are a optimist or a pessimist in humanity's ability to deal with climate change.
Oh, I'm fundamentally an optimist. I don't think you can be in this industry without being an optimist. I've been doing this for 20 years. I always tell my students at Brand that, like, you might be worried about climate change, but like, no one would have told me in like mid 2000s when I started working on this that like U.S. emissions would be falling, would peak around that time and would fall at this rate, almost like without policy. Like at this, like I just want to say, like, that's kind of incredible. So take what you can get, but that is incredible. We're not doing it fast enough, obviously, but I thought coal for another 20, 30 years. So that's that.
Hi, Carl. Thank you so much for being here. I think we met a few months back, and you were certainly more optimistic back then in the White House. My question was that, so baked into your model, you have a carbon price of $55 per ton, which we know is quite a low price. I'm wondering, implicit in this, is there a ratcheting up of that price to really push towards the deep decarbonization of industrial sectors? I mean, to get there, we're going to need a lot more pressure as opposed to the $55 a ton. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah. I mean, we can certainly model it, but if you read the Clean Competition Act, there is an implicit ratchet that's actually quite clever. I mean, their carbon price goes up by the rate of interest, so it's not like necessarily going up in the sense that you're thinking about greater abatement. But what it does is actually, I didn't mention this, but the Clean Competition Act is not a straight on carbon price. It's only a carbon price on, or carbon fee, they want to say it, on dirtier than average U.S. producers. Okay, so there's a nice political economy built in that, like, not everyone is hit. It's just like the dirty ones, and in fact, the cleaner ones benefit, or relatively to the dirty ones. But that threshold actually declines over time. So it starts out 50%, but then it declines over time. So that in like 15, 20 years, it becomes a carbon price for the entire industry. And that's like I actually think that's a very nice design to have both kind of political buy-in in the beginning, but then also ratchet the ambition of the policy over time. Yeah.
Great. So before we wrap up, let me note this is the last seminar of this semester. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Belfer Center, the Mossavar Rahmani Center, and the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability for supporting this seminar. More importantly, I'd like to thank Liz Hanlon and Paul Sherman for all the work they've done to make this seminar go smoothly. It's been a real pleasure. If you have ideas for speakers for the spring seminar, let us know. We also want to thank you, everyone in the room, and those joining us on Zoom for joining us throughout the semester. And finally, please join me for thanking Carl Meng for both his insights and for his service. Thank you.